Mark Few and the Zags still have one scholarship open. Will they end up filling it with a young international big or perhaps a decommitted guard in the 2024 class? We're going to discuss all of that on today's Locked On Zags podcast.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Tuesday and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, make every moment more. Right now, new customers will get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. Well, folks, today we're talking about the one open scholarship for the Gonzaga Bulldogs. 12 of the 13 are filled. We're going to talk about what might happen with that final spot. We're going to close out the show discussing the three Zags who entered the transfer portal this offseason. We did get an update on where one of them will be playing basketball next year. So we'll talk about that to round out the show. But here's the situation. Gonzaga has filled 12 of their 13 scholarships. And for those of you who listened to the Mailbag show on Monday, for those of you who listened to Friday's show, first of all, appreciate you. Shout out again to those everyday listeners. Love having you on the show on a daily basis here. But you know that Gonzaga has filled all but one of the spots, and that we had a lot of conversations about how in an era where a lot of teams, especially high-profile teams, are opting not to do that. We're seeing a lot of teams, and I know I've used this example the last couple episodes, but John Calipari very publicly said he's thinking about only keeping 8 or 9 guys. I'm almost positive that by the time the offseason's over, John Calipari is going to have 10, maybe even 11 players on scholarship. I think that was maybe just him saying something just to say something. That's kind of a bit of who John Calipari is, for better or worse. But there is this sentiment around the coaching kind of sphere of teams that don't want to fill roster spots when they just know, okay, you know, the 10th, 11th guy on my roster, he's not going to play next, or he's not going to stay. I'm developing him for somebody else. That's what John Calipari used to say, which, coming from a coach who had a ton of one-and-done talent, I thought was a little rich. But hey, whatever. Regardless, Mark Few and the Zags seem to be going in a different direction. Last year, they didn't fill every scholarship spot. They only had 11. This year, they already have 12, and they've been in connection with a handful of players to potentially fill that 13th and final spot. And they're doing it in a way where it's kind of preventing them from having this just constant attrition at the end of the roster. That doesn't mean they won't. There are players on Gonzaga's roster right now currently that it would not shock me if a year from now they are in the transfer portal. It wouldn't shock me. That's the nature of the beast in the modern era of college basketball. But Mark Few is setting himself up to recruit players to fill those final spots who are more comfortable with the situation they are in. Braden Smith is the best example of that as a player who has willingly decided to redshirt next season to keep 2 years of eligibility and not play at all next year. That is, in this era, incredibly rare. Braden Smith could have transferred to Cal. I don't know if he would have started at Cal, but he probably would have, if not played a huge role, and then transferred to Gonzaga after that if he wanted to. That was an option that likely would have been there for Braden Smith and Gonzaga. But Mark Few wanted him to be in the system for a year, learn the offense, not have that half year of frustration that Ryan Nembhard had last year. And Braden Smith agreed to that. Great sign for Gonzaga. Emmanuel Inocente did not commit to Gonzaga to play big minutes this upcoming season. So we're seeing Gonzaga be willing to do that. And we're seeing the Zags be kind of ahead of the curve where other teams are not necessarily prioritizing that. They're just we'll just get 10 guys who are all going to play, and instead of filling those final spots, we'll just leave them open. Maybe we'll toss those scholarships to walk-ons, whatever it may be. And Gonzaga still may do that with their final roster spot, their final scholarship. That could be an option for them. But we have seen some names, some players, some kind of archetypes at least connected to that final spot for Gonzaga. The first name that has been mentioned that I talked about last week, I think it was Wednesday or Thursday show last week, is Real Madrid center Ismaila Diagne. Diagne's a 17-year-old, and multiple outlets in Spain reported that Diagne had already committed to Gonzaga. Now, the great Theo Lawson of the Spokesman Review did some legwork, did some digging, and found a source for Gonzaga who said that is not done, that they were working towards a finish line. I think the exact quote was, "Bulldogs are down the stretch, quote, but not done." That was on May 28th. It is now, for many of you listening, June 4th, recording on June 3rd. and we have not heard anything. To be clear, I don't think that means anything bad or good necessarily. It doesn't necessarily mean that Diagne is no longer interested in coming to Gonzaga, that has fallen apart, that the ship has sailed. It doesn't mean that. It could mean that he is still interested and they're still working on just, crossing the T's, dotting the I's, figuring out, with international students, there is still ways for them to get paid. NIL is still a factor. It is just different. And so there's perhaps just some additional conversations that are being had. It's also possible that other schools are recruiting him and that he has not made up his mind formally. It's also possible that he has decided not to come to Gonzaga, and we have not heard that. All of those are possibilities. But right now, I would imagine the most likely scenario for Gonzaga on that 13th and final scholarship spot. If I was a betting man and I was betting on what Gonzaga is going to do with that last scholarship spot, the most likely outcome is that Ismaila Diagne ends up in Spokane. He's a 17-year-old, 7-foot center, good rim protector, very high-level athlete, could develop into a big piece for Gonzaga in the future. But that is hopefully the outcome for Gonzaga. At that point, the roster's full. Mark Few can turn his attention to leading the Team USA to a gold or being a part of that. I guess Steve Kerr and Tyronn Lue and Eric Spoelstra are going to be the other coaches there, but Mark Few is going to be in Paris, France with Team USA, helping to lead them to hopefully a gold medal. So he wants to be out of focusing on the offseason. He wants to be done with that. If they can land Diagne, their offseason is done. 13 out of 13 are filled. They got some extra walk-ons coming in. They are good to go. They've already built for the future with Smith and Innocente, and then now Diagne, if he were to come in, boom, 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 Mark Few is done, ready to roll into the offseason. That's the best case scenario for Mark Few. It's the best case scenario for Gonzaga, and I think it's a likely potential outcome. But he may not come to Gonzaga. It is not guaranteed. As much as we've seen those reporting, it hasn't happened yet. And if it does fall apart, if he does get recruited somewhere else, if he does decide to stay playing with Real Madrid, which is a very good place for him to be, it's a high-profile program. He's been a part of their youth league for a long time. He's put up big numbers for them. If he wants to stay there, Gonzaga pivots their attention elsewhere. And one of the options that we knew was discussed that is no longer an option, although I don't know how realistic of an option it ever truly was, at least not in the last couple of months, that's Nolan Traore. I'll mention this here, then we'll get into the second segment. We'll talk about some other options for that final scholarship spot. But it's not going to go to Nolan Traore. For those who don't know, Traore is a French guard, expected now to be a top 5 pick in the 2025 NBA draft. There's real momentum for him pushing towards top 2. He's not going to go. Cooper Flagg's the projected number 1 pick in 2025, barring an injury or something. He's going to be the top player picked. Ace Bailey is in that conversation. Dylan Harper, other guys as well. But Nolan Traore has put himself in the conversation as a top 5 pick. He's been fantastic playing basketball this spring. And Duke was interested, Alabama was interested, Arkansas was interested. Gonzaga had him on campus in December for the San Diego State game, but he stayed in France. I don't blame him. Look at how successful French basketball has been. Victor Wembanyama is obviously a notable example. Zachary Risache, who's in the draft right now, is a big example. Ryan Rupert, who was drafted by the Blazers last year. There's a lot of really talented French prospects currently. You playing in France, staying overseas is not hurting your draft stock the way that it did 15, 20, 30 years ago. So you might as well stay there, play with the coach you're familiar with, play with the team you're familiar with the rules you're familiar with, make yourself a top 5 pick, and get into the NBA in 2025. Not surprised Nolan Traore is not coming to Gonzaga. Obviously, I don't really have a lot of room for him on this roster anyway, but he is not going to be one of the options. So if it's not Traore, and in a reality where it's not Diagne, which is a possibility, who are those other options? Or is Mark Few going to be set at 12 and leave a scholarship spot open? We're going to discuss that in just a second. Right after I tell you about today's sponsor, LinkedIn Jobs. Folks, when you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. And that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs, because LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster, and they do it for free. And LinkedIn is not just another job board. They help you hire professionals that you cannot find anywhere else, even those who are not actively searching for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role. And in a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users do not visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, folks, you're not looking in the right place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. So hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is constantly finding ways to make this process even easier. That includes launching a feature that helps you write job descriptions. So post your job for free right now at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and 12 of Gonzaga's 13 scholarships are accounted for, but we are spending today's show talking about the one that is not. We talked about Ismaila Diagne, the most notable player that Gonzaga is currently pursuing as of at least a week ago to potentially fill that last spot, 17-year-old who's playing in Real Madrid in Spain. Talked about him, talked about where we're at with that situation. We know that final spot's not going to Nolan Traore, the French guard who's expected to be a top 5 pick in the NBA draft in 2025. We want to look at a couple other options as well. And this is one that cropped up recently that I remembered the name as soon as I saw it and went and looked back. And sure enough, Jamari Phillips, a 2024 guard, 6'3" guard from Glendale, Arizona, 52nd ranked player in the 2024 recruiting class. He has decommitted from Tommy Lloyd and the Arizona Wildcats. And when he was being pursued initially, before he committed way back in December of 2022. He was a 16-year-old kid committed to Tommy in Arizona back in 2022. At the time, Gonzaga was in pursuit. Not surprising. Almost any player you've seen Tommy Lloyd land at Arizona probably was pursued at some point by Gonzaga because they have a similar style and they have a similar, they look for similar archetypes of players. It's not surprising. They worked together for multiple decades. So that is not a shock. Now, Phillips has decommitted from Arizona. The Caleb Love's returning. Jaden Bradley's in the mix. They brought some other guards in. He said, you know what, I'm good. I think I'm going to try to look for another option. But we have seen schools reach out to Jamari Phillips since he has put himself back in the transfer portal. It's not the transfer portal, since he has decommitted from Arizona and reopened his commitment. A handful of very prominent programs have reached out to Jamari Phillips. Gonzaga is not among them. You see Kansas is on there, USC's on there, Georgia Tech's on there, BYU's on there. Perhaps most notably is Oregon because he has already set up a visit. Would not shock me at all if Jamari Phillips ends up playing for Dana Altman and the Ducks. I would mention that as being now they're going to be in the same conference. But weirdly enough, Oregon and Arizona are not going to be in the same conference going forward. So we'll see what happens with Jamari Phillips. But again, for Gonzaga, they have filled so much of their guard rotation for the next couple of years that I'm not surprised they're not going out. They've also been really prioritizing size, and Phillips is a 6'3" non-point guard. I can kind of see why that's maybe not as appealing for them going forward. But with Braden Smith set to play point guard starting next season, with Dusty Stromer expected to be back, with Emmanuel Inocente in the mix, with Steele Venters potentially in the mix. Remember, folks, this upcoming season is not Steele Venters' last year of eligibility. He could come back for another year after that. Smith, Stromer, Inocente, Venters, that is a 4-person group of guards right there. Now, Steele and Dusty can play the 3, so you can bring in some other guards. But keep in mind, folks, Gonzaga already has their hands heavily involved in a handful of 2025 prospects, including Isaiah Harwell, top 10 prospect in the class who visited in February, who's been connected to Gonzaga for a very long time. Davis Fogel, top 75 prospect in the 2025 class from Anacortes, Washington, who's set to visit Gonzaga in June, later this month. And then Jalen Harrelson, a top 10 prospect in the class, who has indicated he wants to set up a visit to Gonzaga. If they land any of those guys, along with the guards they already have, you could see why they're not going to prioritize using this final scholarship spot on the current roster for a guard like Jamari Phillips. And I think a lot of this applies to another name that we very recently heard connected to Gonzaga, and that's Dame Sarr. Dame Sarr is an Italian guard, very young. I think he's recently 17. He's 6'6", so he's a little bit of a bigger guard, so he could kind of maybe play the 3. I haven't watched a ton of him outside of some highlight clips, so I know it's hard to know exactly stylistically where he fits in Mark Few's offense at this point. But the reason I didn't watch a ton of tape on Dame Sarr is I just don't see the fit as being particularly likely. Yes, Gonzaga loves their international prospects. They just landed a 6'5" Italian guard in Emmanuel Inocente. Granted, he came out of the transfer portal, but still, they don't need another player at that position. If they're going to go after 17-year-old international students, they should continue to go after guys like Ismaila Diagne, who is 7 feet tall and can fill a role that Gonzaga is going to need in the future more so than they have needs in the backcourt. We'll keep an eye on Dame Sarr. He's being pursued by Georgia Tech and a handful of other programs. I think Arizona was on the list. No surprise there. We'll keep an eye. If Gonzaga does continue to show interest, we'll definitely talk a little bit more about him. But again, I think if Gonzaga is going to fill this 13th scholarship spot, They're filling it with a big. In my mind, that they've made that fairly clear with the pursuit of Ismaila Diagne. And I think based on just the roster construction, Ben Gregg's done after this year. Graham Ike is not necessarily done after this year. He does have 2 years of eligibility remaining, but it is very possible that this upcoming season will be Graham Ike's last in a Gonzaga uniform. That leaves Braden Huff as your big man going forward. They have some names that they're pursuing in the 2025 and even the 2026 recruiting class, but their need right now is for young bigs to develop in the system. They don't need more young guards to develop in the system. So for me, if they're adding another player, they're adding another big. And I think it's very reasonable to expect, like they've done in the past with, and the list is so long, Killian Tilly, Pavel Zakharov, if you want some more obscure names that they've pursued. Jacob Larson was a big man internationally that they pursued. Obviously, Pavle Stosic, we will talk about him later in the show. And then some of the bigger names, the Domantas Sabonises, the Rui Hachimiras, who's more of a 4, but, the Rob Sakre was Canadian, Shemek Karnowski, Roni Turiaf, they have pursued international bigs with fervor at Gonzaga. That has been what they've done for a very, very long time. So to me, this final scholarship spot, it's either blank or it's an international big. That is my guess. Now, I'm not going to rattle off the name of international bigs who are uncommitted because the amount of research that would take, I'm not even sure if I would be able to do that. Most of the time when these international prospects crop up, they're not names that are typically circulating around for colleges here in the United States. We don't always know which players who are international right now are even interested in coming to play college basketball. So it's very difficult to be able to pull any names unless we've already seen them connected to Gonzaga. So I don't know specific international bigs outside of Diagne, who is, of course, already connected to Gonzaga, that they could pursue. But I wouldn't be surprised if that's the direction this final scholarship ends up going. And it could be a midseason, like they did with Jun Suk Yo a couple years ago, which means they could go into this season without filling this final scholarship spot, leave it open, potentially have it as an option to toss on a walk-on if they wanted to do that, or potentially fill a spot in the middle of the season, or just leave it open for the rest of the year and have a little bit more wiggle room to play with the upcoming offseason after that. Now, I'm going to rattle off a few names of uncommitted bigs who are 2024 incoming freshmen, as well as a few young options in the transfer portal. But folks, the transfer portal right now, especially for bigs, is pretty darn barren. Not a lot of options out there for guys who would come in and be able to have multiple years of eligibility, who really strike me as people who could contribute to Gonzaga even down the line. Talking uncommitted bigs, there's 2 names on the top 150 for 24/7 Sports in the class of 2024 who are uncommitted. One of them is Zion Sensley. If that name sounds familiar, it's because he was committed to St. Mary's and Randy Bennett. And when he decommitted, there was a report that the Gales were going to try to block him from decommitting to try to force him to stay with his NLI. That is a very bad idea. If St. Mary's tries to continue to do that, it's going to really hamper them on the recruiting trail. Regardless, Sensley's going to end up somewhere else. I think St. Mary's is going to wise up here and not try to force him to play at a school he doesn't want to stay at, especially when he can just transfer whenever he wants. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. I don't think he's coming to Gonzaga. It would be hilarious if we find out that Randy Bennett and the Gales, the reason they're blocking him is because he's trying to go to Gonzaga. Very, very funny situation, but that's an alternate reality that I don't think is going to actually come to fruition. The other name here is Luke Bamboye. He's a 6'10" center from Compass Prep High School in Arizona, 133rd ranked player in his class at 24/7 Sports. The last we've heard on him is that he visited VCU and that Cal is interested. No idea how involved Gonzaga could get here, but if they're just looking for a body, somebody to fill that final scholarship spot, they could do much worse than a guy ranked inside the top 150 coming from a very successful high school at Compass Prep. And then the young options that are in the transfer portal, I only pulled 2 that I thought were worth mentioning. Bruce Chang from St. Louis, 7-footer, originally from China, played 30 games last year for the Billikens in the A10, 2.3 points, 2 boards, half a block a game, but he's a very, very big guy. Maybe you just want to bring some size into the program. You also got Diego Cisas from San Jose State. He's only 6'8", so doesn't really qualify as a super big man. He is from Portugal initially, started 7 games last year for the Spartans, averaged about 3.5 points, did shoot 35.5% from 3, was 10 of 28, so pretty small sample size, but 6'8", big, decent rebounder, shot the ball well from 3. You could do worse than finding somebody who's probably like a mini poor man's Ben Gregg of sorts in the transfer portal if you wanted to fill out that final spot. Well, folks, 3 former Zags entered the transfer portal this offseason, including one who just found himself a new home in the Mountain West. We're going to talk about that in just a second. Right after I tell you about today's sponsor, FanDuel. Folks, it is NBA Finals time and Stanley Cup playoffs are in full swing. Baseball is getting towards the dog days of summer, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every single game because right now, new customers who join FanDuel will get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150, folks, win or lose. So bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all in an app that is safe, secure, and super easy to use. And right now, if you're thinking it's time to put some money down on the Zags in 2025, they're at plus 1,800 odds to win it all. They were plus 3,000 when the offseason started, so now is the time to get in before those odds continue to get in better favor for the Zags and making you a little bit less money. So if you want to maximize your chances, then what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon right now and make your first bet an automatic W. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, folks, closing out the show today, talking about the 3 Zags who entered the transfer portal after the offseason, or into the offseason, I should say, excuse me. Last year, we saw a handful of Zags enter the transfer portal as well. Hunter Sallis, of course, ended up at Wake Forest, put together an all-ACC campaign. Somewhat surprisingly, decided to return to Wake Forest for this upcoming season rather than stay in the NBA draft process. People are already penciling him in as a potential All-American for Wake Forest. I think he's going to have a fantastic year. Efton Reed also followed Hunter Sallis to Wake Forest. Played well down the stretch for them last season. Dominic Harris transferred to LMU last year, entered the portal again, is now at UCLA. This year's crop of transfers is not quite as likely to end up at those caliber of programs. Those were 3 guys. Sallis was a 5-star recruit. Harris was a 4-star recruit. Efton was a top 25 prospect when he transferred to Gonzaga from LSU. So a bit more pedigree with those guys. But the 3 players transferring out of Gonzaga, Pavle Stosic, Luka, Krajnovic, and Colby Brooks. Brooks was not a scholarship player. He was a walk-on the last couple of years. Still want to talk about where they're going to go. And I think it's kind of fascinating to track in this era where players who didn't quite crack the rotation for Gonzaga. I mean, I think these guys have upside. Obviously, they're all younger guys. It's interesting to see where they end up. Like, where are they valued around the rest of the college basketball sphere? It's always kind of fascinating to me. And we got the first domino to fall in that conversation with Pavle Stosic, the 6'9", 215-pound Serbian, joined Gonzaga late last offseason. We found out on Monday that he is committed to join the Aggies of Utah State in the Mountain West. Utah State was an 8 seed last year in the NCAA tournament. 2 years ago, their coach, Ryan Odom, was fantastic. They did a lot of great work with them. He left for VCU. After that happened, Danny Sprinkle, who was the head coach at Montana State, took over at Utah State. Everybody projected Utah State was going to be bad last year. They were projected to finish 9th in the Mountain West preseason poll. They not only won the Mountain West, a conference with New Mexico and San Diego State and Boise State and Nevada and all these other great teams, they won the Mountain West regular season. They earned an 8 seed. They got obliterated by Purdue in the second round, but they still were a team far more successful than many expected them to be. Danny Sprinkle parlayed that into just spending 1 year in Logan, Utah, at Utah State, and is now the head coach at Washington, brought his star player, Great Osibor, along with him. So Utah State, once again, back in rebuilding mode. I think they had 9 guys enter the transfer portal this offseason, so tons of room to operate, to add new players. Very excited to see what happens for Pavle Stosic, a guy who he didn't earn a role at Gonzaga, and he wasn't expected to. Pavle didn't commit to Gonzaga until September 23rd. I know that because it was my birthday, and I did not expect to be breaking news doing live videos from my hotel in Bend celebrating my birthday, because normally there's not a lot of breaking news regarding the Gonzaga basketball program in late September. It's just not typically the timeline that they're adding players, but last season was an incredibly wonky offseason for Gonzaga with the Marcus Adams Jr. fiasco, with Caden Perry's injury, with Alex Tui opting not to come to Gonzaga. There was just a lot of chaos at the end of the year. That's how they ended up with Stosic. It's how they ended up with Luka, Krajnovic. Those guys played decent roles last year. Krajnovic more so than Stosic. Pavle played in 14 games, 47 total minutes. He had 14 points, 11 boards, 3 blocks, and 2 assists. He was 6 of 10 on 2-pointers, 0 of 6 from 3. High-level athlete, you could see, especially in Craziness in the Kennel, he got an extended run there. You can tell that he's a very athletic kid. I'm really excited to see what he could potentially bring for Utah State. I don't know enough about their rotation in their lineup, especially as they just bring in so many new players, mostly from the transfer portal. But I'm very curious to see how this team does next year, as well as how Pavle fits into the mix. The other two guys, Luka Krajnovic and Colby Brooks, currently have not committed anywhere in the portal. I'm very nervous recording this on a Monday evening that by the time you're listening on Tuesday, we'll have had an update, even though they've both been in the portal for a very long time and there have not been any real updates on either of them. Krajnovic, of course, 6'3" guard from Croatia, like Pavle Stosic, committed to the Zags late in the offseason. Averaged about 3 points, 1.5 boards last year. Only played in 16 games, but that wasn't because he was frequently sitting because the coaches weren't playing him. He actually missed about 6 weeks of the season with a wrist injury, came back after that, played well in small roles, even got some first half minutes at times, looked like somebody who could kind of carve out a bigger role going forward. Unfortunately, right before the transfer portal deadline, he put his name in the portal. It sounds like Gonzaga's coaching staff had conversations with him that kind of gently pushed him in the direction of choosing to do so. I get the impression that it wasn't exactly his decision to enter the transfer portal. I think that's the more diplomatic way to phrase it, but that's the situation that he's in. We've heard some rumors. And if you want to find out some of those rumors, join the Discord channel. I'm not going to name some schools that I've seen connected to Luka Krajnovic until there's actual tangible reporters talking about it. I just don't want to throw out any bad juju out there on Luka or on anybody else. So we're hearing some rumors. Hopefully we'll hear a commitment soon. Very excited for Luka if he does commit somewhere at the Division I level, if he chooses to go back home and continue to play professionally, whatever he chooses to do. I'm rooting for Luka pretty hard, and I hope that he finds himself in a spot that is conducive to him and works out well for both parties. And then Colby Brooks. Colby Brooks, walk-on at Gonzaga, played 22 games over the last couple of years. He's a 6'7" walk-on who was a very productive high school player in Los Angeles. That's not your typical walk-on type. Played 65 minutes in 22 games for the Zags, scored 35 points, grabbed 25 boards, had a pair of steals, shot 12 of 23 from 2-pointers, which is about 52%. There was a report from Tobias Bass of The Athletic that Colby Brooks had heard from a handful of D1 programs after entering the portal. This tweet was from like late April, so it's been a long time since this update, but Tobias indicated that Drake, Portland State, Denver, Cal Poly, and Cal State Fullerton had all contacted Colby Brooks. I would love to see Colby Brooks play Division I basketball next year. I would love to see him carve out a role at a Big West school like Poly or Fullerton. I'd love to see him at Portland State. You folks, if he plays at Portland State, I'm going to a game. If you're a Portland area Zag, join the Discord channel. We'll talk about doing a meetup. We'll go watch him play a Big Sky game at Portland State. That would be a blast. I got a buddy who works at Denver. I got a buddy who works at Cal Poly. So 3 of the 5 schools that are on this list, I could have a connection for Colby Brooks. So I've been eagerly awaiting finding out where he ends up. I think seeing a Gonzaga walk-on get the opportunity to play at this level somewhere else is really fascinating to me. It's intriguing. I'm interested to see if he's capable of doing it. We had Will Graves, who was a walk-on for Gonzaga, who transferred to a Division III level and was very, very good there. Matthew Lang was a walk-on who transferred to Arizona, but also as a walk-on and kind of had the same role there. So we didn't really get to see him shine in a different way, but very interested in the Colby Brooks and Luka Krajnovic transfer updates. I'm hoping that I'm jinxing it here and that we'll actually get some tangible information about where these two guys are going to end up here in the coming days, because I think it's an exciting part and element of the offseason for Gonzaga that we get to track going forward. It's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Folks, thank you again to those of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Shout out those of you hanging out in the Discord channel as well. We got some more season in review episodes. I know we're all the way into June now, but we'll talk a little bit about some of those guys, how their season went last year, what we expect their role to look like next year. We'll keep you up to date on any transfer portal updates and that final scholarship spot, as well as a look at the NBA draft for Anton Watson, what's going on there. All coming up on future episodes here of Locked On Zags. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, as always, go Zags.